Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going deep into a book that often gets, I think, overlooked in the Bible, but it's one that packs a serious emotional punch. We're talking about the Book of Lamentations.
It's one of those books that, really takes you right into the heart of grief and loss, but it does so with incredible poetic skill.
We're going to unpack its themes, the structure, the historical context. By the end, you'll have like a panoramic view of this powerful piece of writing. We're going to draw insights from some leading scholars to give you like a well-rounded understanding.
Right, so you get the full picture.
Full picture. Okay, so let's start with the title itself. Honestly, I was kind of surprised to learn that it has different names depending on if you're looking at the Hebrew or Greek or Latin versions.
Yeah, it's true. It's like the book has like multiple personalities or something.
Exactly. And those different names hint at some of the emotional layers we're going to be uncovering.
Exactly, yeah. We're all familiar with Lamentations, but the Hebrew title, Isha, it's deeper. It's a bit more complex. It can be translated like, oh, how, or, oh, what is this? So it's not just sadness we're talking about, right? It's shock. It's disbelief at the scale of Jerusalem's destruction.
Right. It's that feeling of being completely overwhelmed by the tragedy.
Right. Like you just can't believe what you're seeing.
Exactly. So right from the start, we're in this place of raw, visceral emotion,
Yeah, absolutely.
And it sets the stage for, we talked about this a little bit before, but it really sets the stage for the 5 distinct laments that make up the book.
Yeah.
Right. And each one focuses on a different aspect of the tragedy. So we're going to kind of unpack each one.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll take them one by one, really dive into them.
Okay. So we have this raw emotion. But one thing that really struck me about Lamentations is that, it's not just like random outpourings. There's a structure. There's a form to these laments. It's actually poetry.
Oh, absolutely. You're picking up on something really important here. It's not just about what's being said, but also the way it's structured. That's part of what makes it so powerful.
Right. So it's like the poet is using the structure to really drive home the emotion.
Exactly. And it's really quite fascinating how the structure works. So chapters 1, 2, and 4 of Lamentations, they're written as acrostics.
Okay, acrostics. Now, for those who haven't encountered that before, what exactly does that mean?
So in an acrostic poem, each verse begins with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
So like the first verse starts with the first letter, second verse, second letter, and so on.
Exactly. And this structure, it really does something powerful, especially in this context. It's like the poet is emphasizing the completeness, the totality of the grief being expressed.
Okay, so the pain is so vast that it encompasses the entirety of language itself.
Exactly. Yeah, like the whole world's turned upside down.
Yeah.
And that's reflected in the very structure of the poem.
That's really, it's a really beautiful way to think about it, even if the topic itself is so sad.
Okay.
So then, what about chapter 3? Because our sources mentioned that it kind of breaks this pattern a little bit.
Yeah, chapter 3. Now this one, it's interesting. So it's 3 times longer than the other chapters, the acrostic chapters, that is. And in chapter 3, each letter of the Hebrew alphabet spans 3 verses, not just one.
So it's still following that acrostic pattern, but it's stretched out.
Yeah, it's like the poet needed more space, more words to express the full weight of their lament in this chapter. Like the grief was just too heavy to be contained within the standard form.
Right. So it's like we're getting even deeper into the depths of sorrow in chapter 3.
Yeah, it's called the plenitude of the lament, and it's not just the structure that makes it different. The voice of the prophet, it shifts in this chapter. He speaks not only for himself, but also as Jerusalem personified.
Okay, so he's like embodying the city's collective suffering.
Exactly.
It's not just one man's grief. It's like the grief of an entire people, a city that's been ripped apart.
Right. And that brings us to the question of authorship. Now, scholars pretty widely believe that Lamentations was written by the prophet Jeremiah.
Oh, okay.
And when you consider he lived through this incredibly tumultuous period, the Babylonian invasion, the destruction of Jerusalem, it makes sense that his words would be so raw, so authentic.
Right. Yeah. It's one thing to read about a historical event, but it's another to hear like the anguished cries of someone who actually lived through it.
Right. Like you're hearing the voice of someone who saw it all happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And those cries echo through each of these 5 laments.
Right. Each one is like a window into a different facet of the tragedy.
So let's take a closer look at those individual laments then, starting with Starting with the first one, what's the focus there?
Okay, so the first lament, it focuses on Jerusalem's desolation, right? The city's fall from grace. And the poet, he uses this powerful imagery comparing Jerusalem to a weeping widow, all alone, abandoned.
Oh, wow. Okay, so right away, we're hit with this sense of loss, like this emptiness.
Right, and this stark contrast between what Jerusalem was and what it has become.
Right. So the first lament, it's really like it's setting the stage. It's driving home this feeling of immense loss.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like that gut punch.
Yeah, it's like that first wave of grief washing over you. Okay.
Yeah.
So we have this foundation of grief, of desolation. Where does the second lament take us?
So the second lament, it delves into a much tougher concept. We start to see the prophet grappling with the idea of God's role in all of this. Like, how could a loving God allow this to happen to his chosen people?
Yeah, that's a big question, a really difficult one.
Yeah, it's the question at the heart of so much suffering, isn't it? And what's so powerful about Lamentations is that it doesn't shy away from these difficult questions. It allows us to see the prophet, struggling with his faith, questioning God.
Right. Like it's real. He's not sugarcoating the pain or offering like easy answers. You know what I mean?
Right, exactly. It's this brutal honesty about what it means to have faith in the face of suffering.
Yeah, and that honesty, that's what makes it so relatable, I think, even thousands of years later. It
Yeah.
shows us that it's okay to question, to doubt, to like wrestle with God when we're hurting.
Exactly. It's human, right, to question when things go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of things going wrong, the second lament, I remember it also like highlights the just total destruction of Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
Like everything's gone.
Yeah, the walls, the gates, the palaces, even the temple, like all of it destroyed.
So it's like every symbol of their identity, their security, it's all gone.
It's like their whole world's been shattered. And the prophet, he's holding God accountable. He's like, how could you let this happen?
Right, right. He's not letting God off the hook. But it's important to remember this is all happening within the context of a relationship.
Right.
It's not just about anger.
Right, exactly. It's like, imagine a child speaking to a parent. There's that hurt, that confusion, but also this deep love, this deep-seated belief that the parent ultimately has their best interests at heart.
Okay. Okay, that helps. It's like he's demanding answers. He's questioning God's justice and his mercy, but it's all coming from a place of still believing, still having faith.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
So, and then we get to this third lament, the plenitude of the lament, which we said really dives deep.
Yeah, it dives deep into the prophet's personal anguish, but
Yeah.
it also expands to encompass the suffering of everyone in Jerusalem.
So it's like the grief reaches its peak in chapter 3.
Right, yeah, the intensity of the emotion, but also the scope of it, like who's experiencing it.
Okay. And it's here that we see like this use of we, right? Where it's suggesting a shared experience of suffering.
Exactly. It's no longer just Jeremiah's pain. It's like the whole city is crying out. He says, he has driven us away. He has made us walk in darkness rather than light. He has stretched out his hand against us. He has shut us in.
So it's like the prophet is becoming the voice of Jerusalem itself, embodying the collective pain and despair. And you also mentioned earlier, like even the structure of the chapter changes. It's longer.
Yeah.
It's like the poet needed like more room to breathe.
Yeah, more space to fully express this shared lament, this communal grief.
Right. Okay. So and then we get into the last two laments, but we'll save that for the next episode because we're already starting to run out of time here.
Sounds good. Yeah, we've got lots more to unpack.
We do, but I think it's I think it's really important for our listeners to kind of take a breath and really absorb the emotional weight of what we've talked about so far. I mean, this is heavy stuff.
Yeah, take some time to reflect. Lamentations, it's not just about understanding the words on the page, but really letting them sink in and resonate with your own experiences.
I agree. It's easy to get caught up in the historical details, the literary structure, but we can't forget that at its core, this is a book about human suffering and the search for meaning in the face of tragedy.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so timeless. I mean, the specifics of the Babylonian invasion might be ancient history, but the emotions that are expressed in Lamentations, the grief, the confusion, the anger, that longing for hope, those are emotions that we all experience.
So as we move into those last two laments in the next episode, I'm really curious to see how those emotions continue to evolve. We've seen the prophet wrestling with God, questioning his justice, but also clinging to that belief in his ultimate goodness. So we'll see where that takes us next time.
Yeah, it's really important to, give yourself that space to process all of this. Lamentations, it's a powerful book.
It is. Okay, so we left off with that feeling of the prophet questioning, really wrestling with God. As we move into the fourth lament, how do those emotions evolve? Do we start to see like a resolution, a sense of peace?
Well, not exactly. The fourth lament, it actually kind of plunges us even deeper into the harsh realities of the situation.
Okay, so it's not getting any easier.
Not quite yet. You see, the first few laments, they focused a lot on the destruction of the city itself and the prophet's own kind of personal anguish. But this fourth one, it really confronts us with the devastating consequences that the survivors are facing.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about those vivid descriptions we talked about earlier, right? The fallen walls, the burned houses, the looted temple. It's one thing to imagine that, but to think about the people who were left, trying to pick up the pieces.
It's hard to even fathom, right? But that's what the fourth lament forces us to confront. It's a raw, unflinching look at the suffering of the people who lived through this.
Okay.
We see images of famine, thirst, disease, even cannibalism.
Oh, wow. That's pretty intense.
It's hard to read. There's no doubt about that. But I think it's important to remember that the prophet isn't just trying to shock us with these graphic descriptions. He's drawing this direct connection between the people suffering and their sins.
Okay. So he's saying this happened because they turned away from God.
It's more than that, I think. It's more about recognizing that our choices have ripple effects.
Okay.
When we choose to walk away from God, we're not just hurting ourselves, we're creating suffering for others.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's that element of accountability, right?
Right.
But it also feels, like you said, it's a warning. It's a cautionary tale.
Exactly.
Like don't stray from the path or this could happen to you.
Yeah, it's a reminder that our actions have consequences, but, it also sets the stage for that final lament, the fifth one, and there we start to see that glimmer of hope.
Okay. I think we could all use a bit of hope at this point.
Yeah.
After all this darkness, all this despair, where do we find that hope? What does this last lament have to offer?
So this fifth lament, it's a communal lament, the prophet speaking on behalf of all the people, and they acknowledge their sin, They admit that they need forgiveness, and they plead with God to restore them.
So it's like they've reached that point of surrender, right? Where they're admitting their own part in the tragedy and just throwing themselves on God's mercy.
Exactly. Yeah. And what's really striking about this lament is that it doesn't end with a guarantee of like everything's going to be fine right now. It's more of a clinging to hope, a trust that God is going to be faithful even when the future is uncertain.
Okay. So it's not about pretending everything's okay, but it's that choice to believe that even when things are terrible, God's still working. He's still there.
Exactly. It's that deep-seated faith that allows them to hold on even when everything seems lost.
You've hit the nail on the head. The fifth lament, it really is a testament to the power of faith, to the power of hope, even when we're surrounded by darkness and despair.
Yeah, it's a powerful message, isn't it?
It is. We've covered so much ground already. I mean, the raw emotion, the theological questions that Lamentations raises. And honestly, it feels like we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to unpack.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. We focus mainly on the kind of emotional and thematic aspects of the book, but there's so much we could explore with the literary structure, the historical context, the theological implications.
Right. Like we touched on that acrostic format.
Yeah.
But we didn't really get into what it means. Like it's not just there because it sounds nice, right? There's a purpose to that structure.
Oh, absolutely. The acrostics and Lamentations, they're very deliberate. Remember, each verse in those chapters, they begin with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet.
Right. So, like an alphabetical poem. But I get the sense there's something more to it than that,
Yeah. This structure, it does a few things. First of all, it emphasizes the completeness of the lament, right?
Yeah.
The pain is so deep, so all-encompassing that, like, you need the whole alphabet to express it.
So it's like the poet is saying words aren't enough, but I'm going to use everything I have to try.
Exactly. And there's another layer here, too. It makes it easier to memorize. Think about it. This was a time before widespread literacy, right? Poetry and songs, they're often memorized and passed down orally.
Okay. So the acrostic structure, it's like a memory tool. It makes it easier for people to remember these laments, to share them.
Exactly. It ensures that those words, those expressions of faith, they're going to be passed down through generations.
That's so fascinating. It really adds a whole new layer to how these texts functioned. It's not just private reflection. It's communal. It's meant to be shared, to be remembered.
Absolutely. That communal aspect, it's at the heart of the message. We don't grieve alone.
Right.
We're part of a community and we
Yeah.
share those burdens.
Right. Okay. So we have this acrostic structure that emphasizes the completeness of the lament and helps with memorization. But we also mentioned that chapter 3, the plentitude of the lament, that it kind of breaks this pattern. It's much longer, and each letter of the Hebrew alphabet spans 3 verses. What's going on there?
So chapter 3, it's really unique. It's like the acrostic structure is being amplified.
Okay.
It's stretched out to try to accommodate the sheer weight of what the prophet's expressing in this chapter.
So it's not just that the content is more intense, but the structure itself is reflecting that intensity.
Yeah, exactly. Like the grief is so deep it needs even more space to be fully expressed. And remember, this is the chapter where the prophet's voice is shifting, right? Sometimes he's speaking for himself, sometimes for Jerusalem, and sometimes he uses we, which suggests this shared guilt, and that need for collective repentance.
So it's not just the length, but also the complexity of the voices of the different perspectives we're getting. It's like it's all coming together, the individual and the communal grief.
Yeah, yeah. It's beautifully put. Chapter 3 really is the heart of the book. That's where the despair is the deepest, but also where those hints of hope start to come through.
Right. Okay. Let's shift gears a bit. We've talked about structure, but what about authorship? Our sources seem pretty confident that Lamentations was written by Jeremiah. Why is that?
Well, there's a strong tradition behind it. And when you look at the historical context, it makes a lot of sense. Jeremiah, he lived through those years leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Right.
He saw the unrest, the invasion, the collapse of everything.
So it's not like reporting on an event. He's writing from his own experience. Yeah.
Exactly. And that gives the book a whole other level of authenticity. It's like we're hearing from someone who saw it all happen, who felt the full weight of it.
Right. It's not just history. It's a testimony.
Yeah, it's raw. It's unfiltered.
Okay. So we've got this incredibly meaningful structure and an author who's writing from this deep personal experience. Let's go back to the 5 laments. The first lament focuses on Jerusalem's desolation, right?
Yeah.
Setting up that contrast between the glory of the past and the ruin of the present.
Right. And it really sets the stage for the whole book's themes, that grief, that loss, that feeling of abandonment, but also that recognition of sin and the consequences of sin. And the imagery is just so powerful, so evocative.
Yeah. You mentioned that comparison of Jerusalem to a weeping widow, abandoned and all alone. That's such a visceral image. It just hits you right in the gut.
Exactly. And the poet uses personification really well,
Yeah.
making the city itself a character in the story. He says that Jerusalem is sitting solitary, her gates desolate, her ways mourning. It's like we're seeing the city come alive in its sorrow, sharing in the grief of the people.
Right. And it's not just mourning. It's like bewilderment.
Yeah.
Like, how could this happen?
Right. The prophet asks, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look around and see. Is any sorrow like my sorrow?" Like he's begging people to notice.
Yeah. To recognize the depth of the suffering. It's like a cry for empathy, for understanding.
Exactly. But it also highlights that contrast between the city's past and its present.
Okay. So the first lament is really setting the stage, introducing those themes of grief, loss, and that connection between sin and suffering. What about the second lament? Where does that take us?
So the second lament goes even deeper into the idea of surrendering to the enemy. And it really starts to wrestle with this idea that God allowed this to happen, maybe even caused it.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
Yeah,
I mean,
but-
how do you reconcile that with the idea of a loving God?
It is. It's a real struggle. And the prophet, he doesn't pretend it isn't. He uses these powerful verbs to describe God's actions, like devouring, deribing, cutting down, rejecting. It's a really harsh image of the city's fall.
It's like he's saying God was a part of this.
In a way, yeah. But it's important to remember that the prophet, he's questioning, he's challenging, but it's coming from a place of faith. He's not rejecting God. He's engaging with him.
Okay. So it's honest dialogue.
Yeah.
Even when it's difficult, even when it's painful.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's not about finding easy answers. It's about that raw honesty of faith in the midst of suffering.
Okay. So we have that that confrontation with God's role in the destruction. Is there anything else that stands out to you in this second lament?
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on the specific things that were destroyed, the walls, the gates, the palaces, even the temple. And I think it's a way of emphasizing just how complete the ruin was.
Right. It's like, it's not just defeat. It's like everything that represented their identity, their security, it's all gone.
It's like their world has literally been dismantled. And the prophet saying, God, you allowed this to happen.
Yeah, that's powerful. So then we get to the third lament, the one our sources call the plenitude of the lament.
Right, chapter 3. And it's a real turning point in the book. It's the longest chapter. And it goes deeper into the prophet's own anguish, but it also moves beyond that individual suffering to encompass the pain of the whole city.
So it's like the lament is deepening, becoming more communal.
Exactly. And that's where we see that use of we, suggesting this shared experience of suffering. The prophet says, he has driven us away. He has made us walk in darkness rather than light. He has stretched out his hand against us. He has shut us in.
So it's not just Jeremiah's pain anymore. It's like everyone is feeling this.
Right. And it's not just physical suffering. It's emotional. It's spiritual. He talks about feeling trapped, lost, abandoned. He says, he has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or cry for help, he shuts out my prayer.
That's a powerful image. It's like being completely cut off from God.
Yeah, it's like hitting rock bottom. But even in the midst of this despair, there's a glimmer of hope. He starts to shift from just lamenting to actually pleading for mercy, for restoration.
Okay, so there's a turning point,
Yeah.
right? What are some of the things he says that show this shift?
One of the most powerful lines is, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness.
It's like he's holding on to that belief that God's love is still there, even when he can't feel it.
Exactly. And that shift sets the stage for the next two laments. We're starting to move from just the destruction and despair to a sense of possibility.
Okay, I'm definitely ready for that. What about the fourth lament? Does that hope continue?
Well, the fourth lament, it's still pretty bleak. It's really focused on the suffering of the survivors.
So no happy ending just yet.
Not quite. We see some really graphic descriptions of famine and thirst, even cannibalism.
Wow, that's hard to imagine. What's the point of all that? Is it just to shock us?
No, it's not about being gratuitous. It's about confronting the consequences of sin. It's about showing just how bad things got because the people had turned away from God.
Okay, so it's like that wake-up call, that reminder that our actions have consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it sets the stage for the final lament, where we do finally see that hope emerging more fully.
Okay, good. I'm ready for that. What does that final plea, that fifth lament look like?
So in that fifth lament, the prophet is speaking on behalf of all the people. They acknowledge their sin, they ask for forgiveness, and they beg God to restore them.
So it's like this collective cry for help.
Yeah.
They're owning up to their mistakes and asking for mercy.
Right. And what's interesting is that they're not shying away from their responsibility in all of this. They know they messed up.
Right. They're admitting that they strayed from God.
Exactly. And that's what makes the hope possible, because they say, restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return, renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. They're asking for a second chance.
So even in all of this tragedy, there's that faith that God can make things right, that he can heal and restore.
Exactly. It's not about going back to exactly how things were, but it's that hope for a future.
Okay, so we started with that shock and disbelief of Micah. We went through those 5 laments that really explored all of that grief and the complexities of faith. And now we end with this plea, this hope for restoration. It's like the book itself is a journey.
That's a great way to put it. And it's a journey that we can all relate to, right? We all experience those moments of loss, of despair. But Lamentations shows us that we're not alone in that. It's okay to grieve, to question, to lament. And even in the darkest times, there's always that possibility for healing, for restoration, for new beginnings.
Okay, so before we wrap up, is there a final thought, a question, something you'd like to leave our listeners with as they continue to explore this book?
Yeah, I think a good question to consider is this. If Lamentations is a response to one specific event, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, how can it still speak to us today? How can those themes of grief and repentance and hope resonate with our own struggles, with the challenges that we face in the world?
Welcome back. We're continuing our deep dive into Lamentations. And I think one of the most striking things about this book is how honest it is about those raw emotions, but also about like some really tough theological questions.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back, does it? I mean, it really delves into the nature of God, the problem of suffering, the possibility of hope when things seem completely hopeless.
Right. And one thing that really struck me, especially as we were talking about those first couple of laments, was how directly the prophet questions God.
Wow.
He almost seems to like blame God for what happened to Jerusalem. So how do we reconcile that with this idea of a loving, merciful God?
Yeah, that's a question that's been wrestled with for centuries. But what's important to remember is that in the biblical tradition, lament it's not a sign of weak faith. It's an act of trust.
Okay. So you're saying it's like he's so close to God that he feels like he can be completely honest. Like he can pour out his pain, his confusion, his anger, and he trusts that God can handle it.
Exactly. He's not, holding back. He's not afraid to challenge God. And by doing so, he's modeling this way of relating to God that's authentic, it's real, and that's something that I think a lot of us struggle with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We feel like we have to have it all together. Like we need to have the answers, especially when it comes to suffering. But Lamentations, it gives us permission to just be real with God about those messy, those difficult parts of life.
Right. It's an invitation to confront the pain,
Yeah.
to have that honest dialogue with God about our experiences. And out of that honesty, that's where repentance can come. And we see that theme woven throughout Lamentations.
Yeah. There's that acknowledgement that the people suffering, it's not random. It's connected to their choices. They're turning away from God.
Right. It's not about just blaming God. It's about understanding the role of human actions, the consequences of sin.
Mm.
And recognizing that becomes essential for healing, for restoration.
Okay. So lament, it's this act of trust. Repentance is about turning back towards God. But Lamentations it's a pretty bleak book, isn't it? Where's the hope in all of this?
Yeah, it doesn't sugarcoat the despair. But
Yeah.
but even in those dark moments, there are these glimmers of hope that emerge, and they're rooted in the very character of God, in his love, his faithfulness, even when it feels like he's absent.
Okay. So how does that hope, how does it kind of peek through in the text? What are some examples?
One of the most powerful expressions of hope, it comes in chapter 3, right in the middle of the prophet's deepest anguish. He says, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness."
Wow. It's like he's holding on to that tiny ember of faith, reminding himself that even when everything feels terrible, God's love is still there.
Exactly. And then in that final lament, that ember becomes this plea for restoration. He cries out, "Restore us to yourself, Lord, that we may return. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us." It's an acknowledgement that only God can bring about true healing.
Okay, so the book doesn't end in like resignation. It ends with this yearning for God's mercy, this trust that even if things don't go back to how they were, there's still a future.
Yeah. And that's what makes Lamentations ultimately a book of comfort, of encouragement.
Mhm.
It reminds us that even when we're facing tragedy, when we feel lost and abandoned, God is still with us. His love is constant. His mercy is there for those who turn to him.
And that message, it goes way beyond just the specific historical context of, ancient Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
It speaks to our struggles
Yeah.
today, whether it's personal loss, societal issues, global crises. We all face those moments where it feels like we're living in our own version of Lamentations.
Absolutely. And the book gives us this framework, a way to process those emotions, to be honest with God, and to find hope, even in the midst of the ruins, the brokenness.
Yeah. So if there's one thing I'm taking away from this deep dive, it's that faith isn't about pretending everything's okay. It's about holding on to hope, even when we don't have the answers, and knowing that God is like big enough to handle our doubts, our anger, our questions.
Yeah, beautifully put. Lamentations is a testament to that, to the resilience of faith,
Yeah.
the power of lament, and that enduring hope that, like the prophet said, it's new every morning.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Lamentations. We hope this has been thought-provoking and even encouraging. It's okay to lament, to grieve, to question, but don't ever lose sight of that hope that shines through, even in the darkest times. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.